I just want to let you know that there has been a horrible miscommunication. I informed Elaine that our phone conversation was a true pleasure, and because I'm a comic and all, she assumed I was being sarcastic. She anticipated that I would say, yeah, talking to her on the phone is a real treat. Yes, but my sincerity was genuine. On the Seinfeld set, something unprecedented occurred in February 1991. The entire cast refused to film and left. "We're not doing this," one actress replied after reading a single paragraph about assassinating presidents. They constructed sets. They hired guest stars. That day, however, the episode died. No one knew the truth for 33 years until the script was discovered online. We now understand why the creators themselves believed it went too far. Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David weren't pursuing a major TV contract on a cold November 1988 evening. All they desired was a snack. Just off the sets of the Catch a Rising Star Comedy Club, they entered a tiny Korean grocery store in Manhattan. They began their typical riffing as they strolled the aisles. "Why jelly?" Larry inquired, pointing to a container of Korean jelly. "Why not spray or foam?" The strange objects on the steam table made them laugh. In reality, who consumed this stuff? Then Larry came to a halt. "The show should be like this," he remarked, glancing at Jerry. "Only this sort of talk." Jerry didn't leap with joy. He gave a shrug. It was an odd notion. A show about nothing? Larry, however, was being serious. What if a sitcom focused on the small details that people tend to ignore rather than major events or corny lessons? What if the humor was ordinary nonsense? That wasn't requested by NBC. In order to cover a Saturday night slot when Saturday Night Live wasn't broadcasting, they had promised Jerry a one-time 90-minute special. They anticipated sketches and even stand-up. However, Jerry and Larry realized it wouldn't work when they sat down to write it. They took a chance because their concept was too delicate for a boisterous variety show. They wrote a 30-minute sitcom pilot in place of the 90-minute concept. The Seinfeld Chronicles was based on that script. It concentrated on shirt buttons, laundry peculiarities, and dry cleaners. The Dick Van Dyke Show's soundstage was used for its filming. That was encouraging to Larry, but Jerry wasn't convinced yet. The two reconnected at the Westway Diner the following evening following a performance at the Improv. Larry made a different pitch. "Let's demonstrate the source of a comedian's content. The real show is that." For Jerry, that made sense. In actuality, it wasn't about nothing. The process was the focus. The late-night concept turned into a revolution in late-night television. Larry pursued this show for another purpose. He had no money. No permanent work, and a reputation for leaving writers' rooms in 1988. He once couldn't afford anything else, so he gave a pal a collection of jokes as a birthday present. But Seinfeld saw that those jokes made people laugh. Larry realized that this might be his chance to finally make anything happen when NBC contacted. He took the studio notes, bent more than normal, and worked non-stop. There was now something to prove for the man who had previously left Saturday Night Live after just one sketch. The title of the show was also a mess. It was not trusted by NBC. They attempted to rename it Pilot, Good News, Bad News, The Seinfeld Chronicles, Stand Up, and even The Jerry Seinfeld Show. Until someone simply suggested, "Let's keep it simple, Seinfeld," nothing stuck. However, the show's near collapse before it even began was concealed by its straightforward title. It wasn't easy casting either. Chris Rock and Danny DeVito declined to play George Costanza. Later, Chris Rock made a joke about being the black friend. Making films like Twins kept Danny DeVito too busy. He had no desire to be a sidekick. Jason Alexander, a New York theater performer, was left. When they were casting, he wasn't even in Los Angeles. He was given a few pages of the screenplay at random, and it read like a Woody Allen film to him. Thus, he took the only action that sprang to mind. He made a ridiculous Woody Allen impression on tape. Voice, glasses, everything. They called, even though he thought they wouldn't. "We adore it," they exclaimed as they flew him out. Simply soften the Woody a little. George Costanza appeared out of nowhere. The first pilot didn't even include Elaine. NBC instructed Jerry and Larry to include a lady because they felt it was too masculine. Auditions came pouring in. Jerry was impressed by Megan Mullally. Rosie O'Donnell and Patricia Heaton also did. Then Julia Louis-Dreyfus entered, though. Jerry knew after 30 seconds. He subsequently remarked, "She makes you laugh without making you crazy." For that role, Julia took home 2 Emmys. She was referred to by Jerry as the show's glitter. Kramer then appeared. Casting that character was simple, but it had a twist. Michael Richards, renowned for his physical humor, has previously collaborated with Larry. Incredibly physical. He reportedly wanted a sack of dirt to make a joke work on a sketch show. For a while he went as far as that. They had to keep extra door hinges on hand for Seinfeld. They were constantly broken by his entrances. To prevent injury, he would put pads below his clothing. He would rehearse by himself, creating bizarre sound effects without a script. Kramer was not what he was playing. Kramer was his name. The genuine Kramer comes next. Kramer, Kenny. He lived next door to Larry David. He first objected to his name being used unless he was given the opportunity to play the role. Kramer was therefore referred to as Kessler in the pilot. In the end, they just paid $1,000 to buy Kenny off. That was it. The rights to a name that would become famous would cost $1,000. NBC execs had a chilly response when they first saw Seinfeld's pilot in early 1989. NBC's entertainment division president Brandon Tartikoff didn't simply ignore it. He made fun of it. It was too Jewish, he claimed, and too New York. Ironically, he was both of them. Nor was he by himself. 24 high-ranking executives watched the pilot, and while some of them laughed, Tartikoff remained unflappable. Who will want to see 4 Jews wandering around New York acting neurotic? He famously remarked. The show was almost ruined by that remark. However, 2 guys, Rick Ludwin and Warren Littlefield, fought to keep it alive behind the scenes. They campaigned for the show because they thought it had a strange charm. Tartikoff would eventually reverse his position and refer to Seinfeld as one of the most significant television programs of the 1990s. The executives weren't the only ones who didn't understand it at first, he just didn't. NBC took things a step farther and tested the pilot with 400 households. The outcomes? Brutal. After airing the show on underutilized cable channels, they conducted questionnaires. The entire situation was deemed weak in the feedback document, which Littlefield carried around on his desk like a scar. No one desired to rewatch it. The supporting cast was unpopular with the audience. They believed Jerry needed a more capable support band. People were not even aware of Jerry's occupation. The scenes in the laundry were the subject of one note. They advised against getting overly thrilled about going to the laundromat. That line hurt, especially because the whole premise was that sort of ordinary, dull bullshit. It nearly resulted in death. They kept the message a secret from Jerry and Larry David, but Littlefield recalled it as a knife to the heart. Not until years later, when copies of the message were framed and displayed in their restrooms as memorials to everyone's mistakes. The network didn't believe it, though. NBC did not regard the pilot as a launch until it finally aired on July 5, 1989. It was buried. Insiders referred to it as rubbish dump theater. For dead pilots they just wanted to get rid of, it was a peaceful summertime slot. The figures weren't bad. It received a 10.919 Nielsen rating. In other words, 10.9% of American households watched. Although 19% of the TVs were in use, it failed to secure its time slot. It was tied with some hidden camera show on Fox and beat by a CBS police program. It wasn't even on NBC's official schedule for 1989-90. It was already done inside. Ludwin was not finished fighting, though. He diverted the funds and canceled a Bob Hope special. The show gained 4 more episodes as a result of that decision. Only 4. In the history of sitcoms, it was the smallest order. However, it was sufficient. On May 30, 1990, the 4 episodes were finally broadcast. This indicated that the next episode was released 11 months after the pilot. The show's studio, Castle Rock, attempted to sell it elsewhere during that time. Nobody desired it. The only thing keeping the show afloat was NBC's meager order. However, the pilot performed far better when it was re-aired precisely a year later. It received a 26% share and a 13.9 rating. That was sufficient for Season 2 to be greenlighted. Seinfeld nearly died during that year-long limbo, but it also allowed it to settle into a groove. From that precarious start, Seinfeld blossomed into one of the most lucrative television programs ever. It was earning NBC $200 million annually by the late 1990s. The show doesn't get money from that. After expenses, NBC earned that amount. The production cost of the show was approximately $50 million every season, or $2 million per episode. However, they were earning $550,000 for each 30-second commercial. There was only one conclusion from the math. Seinfeld was a treasure trove. To save the last season, NBC even shelled out an additional $30 million. That was something they had never done before. Since then, they have never had to. Then there was Jerry. He did something no actor had ever done before in 1997. He was paid $1 million for each episode. That garnered international attention. Each line brought in roughly $13,000 for him. He was initially compensated $20,000 for each show. Then, $40,000, and then $100,000. He earned $500,000 per episode by Season 7 and 8. He hit $1 million by Season 9. After accounting for inflation, his total revenues from the show rose to about $60 million, or nearly $100 million. What followed was made possible by that action. Following suit, the Friends cast demanded and received the same $1 million payout. Later, Courtney Cox claimed that many studios were alarmed by Seinfeld's contract, but when Jerry declined, it was the worst shock of all. He was offered $5 million per episode by NBC in 1998 to return for season 10. For only 20 episodes, that would have amounted to almost $100 million. No, he responded. The NBC executive who had always supported him, Warren Littlefield, was taken aback. He claimed that they were so sure that no one could turn down their offer. Jerry, however, did. He informed them that he no longer had a life, just the show, no wife, no children. It wasn't worthwhile. He turned to leave. He claimed that he wished to end Seinfeld on a high note, and he did. On May 14, 1998, the last episode was broadcast. 76.3 million people watched it. In American history, it became the third most watched series finale. 67% of all TVs in the United States were set to Seinfeld that evening. Other shows joked about it since it was so large. In order to allow parents to watch from home, Boy Scout meetings finished early. It was the focal point of people's evening plans. The core four were imprisoned for failing to halt a mugging and ended up in jail in the two-part conclusion, which also brought back previous characters. Fans were split on that conclusion. Jerry stood by it even though he later acknowledged that it might have been an error. Decades later, he and Larry David even brought up the concept again in Curb Your Enthusiasm, describing the conclusion as an arrow that struck the sun. Seinfeld was more than simply a smash, though. It altered the way people spoke. It introduced a new language to the world. Again, close communicator. Regifting. Dipping twice. No one was interested in dipping a chip twice prior to Seinfeld. It was essentially a crime after that. Festivus evolved into a legitimate holiday. In Colorado, December 18th was even designated as National Regifting Day. The peculiar phrases from the show become commonplace. America understood itself in the pre-internet era through Seinfeld. We have Wikipedia these days, someone once said. We had Seinfeld back then. And for some reason, it all began with a pilot that no one trusted. However, something was going on in the background. One of the biggest near misses in television's history is the Chinese restaurant episode that almost led to the show's cancellation in season 2. Because NBC detested it so much, they postponed the show in the hopes that it would quietly vanish. Although it was filmed as season 2's 6th episode, it wasn't broadcast until much later. We don't understand this show, and we think it's wrong, they told Jerry and Larry David bluntly. Larry, however, was not going to give up. His goal was to depict the actual sensation of waiting for 5 to 10 minutes. Everything changed when the episode aired in spite of NBC's concerns. Fans adored it. Seinfeld became something else after that odd little incident. It demonstrated that it was possible to break TV's rules. Then there was another danger. It has to do with masturbating this time. Although Larry David had been clinging to the idea for years, he believed the censors would never approve it. Not even the word masturbation was mentioned. The term master of my domain was used by the characters instead. Surprisingly, NBC agreed and allowed it to air despite receiving 62 complaints later. Why? Because if they didn't, Larry would resign. The risk was worthwhile. One of the most recognizable episodes in television history was this one. It even took home an Emmy for primetime. It was then imitated by other television programs such as Big Mouth and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. However, none of them were ever able to match the initial astonishment and brilliance of that initial broadcast. Threatening to resign was nothing new for Larry David. He did it frequently. That's it, he would declare at the conclusion of each season. You can't do that again. It wasn't only drama though, as Jason Alexander recalls how this became into a common joke on set. Larry was truly worn out. It was cruel to write a 60-page script in 2 days, 8 months of the year. According to Jerry, the work almost killed them. The pressure was all on Larry. He thought he would be held accountable if the show didn't succeed. He eventually quit at the end of season 7. Go, Jerry told him. Jerry dropped the stand-up scenes without Larry. Simply put, there was no more time to do everything. The humor in the show was controversial as well. The entire episode had strong Jewish overtones, from their arguments to their facial expressions, even though Jerry was the only character who publicly identified as Jewish. For some, that became an issue. In one incident, Mohel circumcised a nervous person. A rabbi was introduced by another, which infuriated several spectators. To the Anti-Defamation League, more than 100 complaints were sent. It was deemed tasteless by critics. Others, however, defended the program. Finding comedy in life and ourselves has always been essential to Jewish survival, according to Jerry's own sister. Stereotypes were even reversed in the show. Jerry was a Jewish man who enjoyed spending money. The stingy one was George, who wasn't. Deliberately, George Costanza's clothing also caused issues. Jason Alexander's clothing was too tiny. Making George appear to be a man who is barely able to hold himself together was the aim. And it was successful. He appeared anxious and uneasy all the time. Ironically, Alexander looked heavier due to the tight clothing, even though he was in good physical condition. Some of the costumes, such as the original sneakers from the show and 2 sport coats, are still in his possession today. George's glasses are kept in a secure deposit box by him. Even Elaine's pregnancy was concealed by wearing bulky, immobile clothing. Every aspect was meticulously coordinated by the wardrobe staff. However, not all of it was broadcast. NBC refused to touch the one line that was intended for George. Black people never order salads, as far as I can tell. It was meant to introduce a whole racial episode. NBC promptly turned it down. They were okay with making jokes about masturbating, but this was when they went too far. They said it was inappropriate for a show with no black cast members to make fun of African American customs. Not even that episode was written. Although the network typically allows the Seinfeld team to push the boundaries, this was a rare instance of their saying no. Kramer was occasionally obstructed as well. He was suing a bar for promoting a ladies' night in one of the episode ideas. Writer Carol Leifer proposed it, claiming gender discrimination. Jerry and Larry rejected the story, despite the fact that she had penned hits like The Rye. Their style didn't suit it. Kramer volunteered for medical experiments, which was another idea Leifer had. That one was also shut down. It was simply too gloomy. Although they had limitations, the show frequently pushed boundaries. Charles Larry, known for pushing things too far too quickly, this writer was one of the show's darkest. He penned tales about stalkers, Nazis, and even a poorly performed circumcision. Old comedies and noir movies served as his inspiration. He created invisible characters like Bob Sacamano and gave Kramer his wild side. However, some of his concepts were simply excessive. His scripts, including one involving weapons, were rejected by NBC, and one with racist overtones. Later, when he had greater latitude, Charles applied that daring aesthetic to films like Borat and The Dictator. The cast was truly powerful by season 2. They shut down an episode called The Gun with it. Elaine was expected to purchase a firearm. "We're not going to do this," Julia Louis-Dreyfus stated. A situation infuriated Jason Alexander. Elaine made jokes about killing presidents there. Michael Richards was unable to influence their decision. "This isn't happening," the actors informed the director. They had previously constructed sets. They had hired actors. However, the entire project was abandoned. Never before had the program canceled an episode at that point in its run. For the actors and crew, it turned into a pivotal moment. It was the best episode. In February 1991, it was almost broadcast. It was intended to be Season 2, Episode 4. Everything was prepared. Sets were constructed, scenes were practiced, and guest stars were cast. However, the table read for December went terribly wrong. After being robbed, Elaine would have purchased a gun and developed an unsettling obsession with it. It was something Julia Louis-Dreyfus declined to do. "You can't make a funny show about guns," director Tom Sharonis stated. Additionally, Kramer's first name, which was eventually altered to Cosmo, would have been revealed in the episode as Conrad. However, things worsened. Elaine made reference to 2 assassinated presidents in a sentence about having to choose between a Kennedy and a McKinley. Jason Alexander claimed that after reading the passage, Julia gave him the most dejected expression he had ever seen. The writing went too far, particularly because the show frequently made references to JFK. Additionally, the film JFK had just been released. In one unsettling subplot, Kramer claimed to have had sex with a flight attendant and forced his companions to find her in order to confirm it. That narrative pulled the protagonists into a grotesque scenario and treated a woman like an object. Even worse, Elaine pulls her revolver unintentionally during the altercation. The combination of gun violence and sexual humiliation in one scenario was disastrous. The cast responded quickly and cohesively. The first person to say no was Julia. Jason supported her. Michael Richards couldn't persuade anyone, but he wasn't as disturbed. Every member of the cast got up and left the show. In the parking lot, director Tom Caronis bumped into Glenn Padnick, an NBC executive, and revealed the information. Padnick felt a sense of relief. "We just couldn't solve the funny problem," Jerry subsequently recalled. "Taste wasn't the issue. It has to do with equilibrium. And there was none in this episode. Still, the extent of its progress is astounding." Ernie Sabella and Bobby Joe Lathan were previously hired as guest stars. Later on in The Stranded, Lathan portrayed Patty. Sibella appeared in the subway as the nude man. The set for the gun shop was finished. The expense of the cancellation was high. To make matters worse, Larry and Jerry had only 2 days to create a whole new script, The Phone Message. That was a big risk for a show with poor ratings and a limited budget. However, they made the right decision. The deleted script reappeared online years later. In 2024, a Reddit user discovered it and shared it. Larry Charles, who recognized his own handwritten notes, attested to its authenticity. Fans were finally able to witness Seinfeld's near miss with an unrecoverable line. The wager was more than simply a cancelled episode. In a sense, it began as every other ridiculous Seinfeld moment would. Desperate to use the restroom, Kramer pretended to be a wealthy industrialist, just to sneak into someone else's place, pennypacker. He walked out into the tumult of the Puerto Rican Day Parade after crashing there with Jerry and George to watch the Mets game. He was given a sparkler by someone. Harmless fun, isn't it? However, it went awry in typical Kramer way. A Puerto Rican flag was touched by the sparkler. It was on fire. Kramer threw it to the ground and began stomping on it in a panic. Just a few seconds of slapstick humor ignited a national fury. The flag was a symbol, not merely a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of pride, culture, history, and struggle for millions of Puerto Ricans. It felt insulting to witness a character tread on it after watching it burn on screen. Enraged by what they perceived to be a willful act of contempt, the audience in the concert turned into a mob. However, viewers at home were the ones who were truly incensed. The show premiered on May 7, 1998. 38.8 million people watched it. Thus, it became the second most viewed Seinfeld episode ever. The outcry was simply amplified by the large crowd. Then came the line that set the whole thing on fire. Kramer murmured, "It's like this every day in Puerto Rico," as he watched the irate mob destroying Jerry's automobile from the protection of the apartment. Although it was intended as a joke, many people didn't find it amusing. What might have been dismissed as unintentional humor was transformed into something more sinister, sounding like a racist slur. It portrayed Puerto Rico as a chaotic, dangerous place. The National Puerto Rican Coalition's leader, Manuel Mirabal, said that seeing the flag burning made his anger boil. However, the stereotype was equally awful. Fernando Ferrer, the president of the Bronx Borough, said the comment about everyday violence was unacceptable. Many Puerto Ricans felt that the scene did more than merely make fun of their culture. It reaffirmed unpleasant notions they had worked for decades to dispel. NBC also felt the pressure. Not only was the backlash audible, it was also evident. Outside of NBC's New York offices at the Rockefeller Center, protesters gathered. This movement wasn't marginal. These protests were planned and directed by well-known local leaders. Anger-filled callers overwhelmed Latino radio stations. Ferrer's office was flooded with grievances. The pressure on NBC was genuine, despite the fact that Mayor Giuliani's administration apparently received none. They didn't merely apologize. The episode was canceled. For 4 years, NBC prohibited the Puerto Rican Day from being aired. That was enormous. Their money was Seinfeld. Despite the enormous advertising revenue generated by reruns, NBC decided to withdraw it. Even though they claimed in their statement that they didn't intend to insult anyone, the bleeding continued. The episode vanished from syndication packages between 1998 and 2002. Even now, some networks still won't show it. The demonstrations were successful. They compelled one of the world's most potent networks to concede, and they were explicit about it. Even if they are inadvertent, jokes that go too far cannot be excused as humorous. However, it was not the case for everyone. Even Jerry Seinfeld was irritated. The indignation seemed out of place to him. The program wasn't even about Puerto Ricans, in his opinion. It just so happened to take place during a parade in Puerto Rico. Indeed, the authors, David Mandel and Steve Coren, subsequently asserted that nothing would have changed if they had placed the story during any ethnic parade in New York. Critics, however, didn't believe it. The very real background of Puerto Rico's political and cultural conflicts with the United States was disregarded in that argument. It did matter which parade was chosen. The fact that so many demonstrators hadn't even watched the episode only infuriated Jerry. He went up to a protester and questioned how they could be so outraged without realizing it. The solution? We believe it to be offensive. That was a powerful moment. Regarding the development of media anger in the late 1990s, just word of mouth, radio talk, and a title. No Twitter, no viral videos. However, that was plenty to ignite everything. Ironically, NBC was making record profits while navigating one of its most significant scandals. Seinfeld's syndication rights brought in an incredible $1.7 billion in 1998. Larry David took home $250 million upfront and an additional $40 to $50 million annually for his portion. Additionally, Jerry Seinfeld held 25%. The show's syndication revenue reached over $3 billion by 2013. Regardless of the controversy, people continued to watch. If anything, the show was more valuable because of its dark humor and unrepentant greedy characters. That notion, the idea that moral complexity may still lead to commercial success, has only become stronger in the age of streaming. Seinfeld's worldwide streaming rights were purchased by Netflix in 2019 for more than $500 million. By 2021, that agreement was in effect. It covered all 180 episodes over the course of 5 years. For comparison, NBC Universal spent $500 million on Warner Media and The Office, purchased Friends for $425 million, but those were exclusive to the US. Netflix expanded globally. Why? Because they thought that Seinfeld's humor, despite its awkward and provocative elements, was nevertheless universal. To put it plainly, Seinfeld is still in the spotlight 30 years after its debut, according to Mike Hopkins of Sony Pictures Television. Alternatively, edgy sells, even if it is offensive.